Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Living with ADHD and CPTSD. Today's episode is an ADHD episode, and we are going to talk about dopamine. I'm sure a lot of you have heard and read about this dopamine that is something that affects us, people who have ADHD. And I, for one, am very familiar with it, and I've done a lot of research on dopamine and exactly how it affects us and what it does. Like it's not the reason why we have ADHD, of course, but it does have a lot to do with our behaviors and, like ability to focus on something, the ability to maintain doing tasks, like being interested in something. There's a lot behind the whole dopamine aspect when it comes to ADHD, though. So I'm going to discuss it with everybody today. So ADHD, all right, we all know attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The underlying issues with the brain are likely to be the underlying cause of ADHD. No one knows exactly what causes a person to have ADHD, but some researchers have looked at a neurotransmitter called dopamine as a possible contributor to ADHD. Dopamine allows us to regulate emotional responses and take action to achieve specific rewards. It's responsible for feelings of pleasure and reward. Scientists have observed that levels of dopamine are different in people with ADHD than those without ADHD. Some researchers believe this difference is because neurons in the brains and nervous systems of people with unmedicated ADHD have higher concentrations of proteins called dopamine transporters. The concentration of these proteins is known as dopamine transporter density, or DTD. A higher DTD results in a lowering of dopamine levels in the brain, which may be a risk factor for ADHD. Just because someone has high levels of DTD, however, does not mean they have ADHD. Doctors will typically use a holistic review to make a formal diagnosis. Many medications for treating ADHD work by increasing dopamine and stimulating focus. These medications are typically stimulants. They include amphetamines, yes, such as amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, or Adderall, or methylphenidate, Concerta, Ritalin. These medications increase dopamine levels in the brain by targeting dopamine transporters and increasing dopamine levels. Some people believe that taking a high dosage of these medications will lead to greater focus and attention. This is not true. If your dopamine levels are too high, this can make it difficult to focus. Scientists have been studying the link between dopamine transporters and ADHD symptoms. However, other research suggests that structural changes in the brain may also play a role in ADHD. According to the DNA Learning Center, a small study in 16 children and adolescents with ADHD found that medications that increase the availability of dopamine in the brain lead to the inhibition of the motor cortex, the brain region that controls voluntary movement. This effect was more significant in children with genetic variation called DAT1, which is a gene that usually increases the activity of dopamine transporters. These results suggest that genetic factors that affect dopamine transporters may play a role in the development of ADHD. The DNA Learning Center also reported on another study that compared the MRI brain scans of children with and without ADHD. The researchers that found that the children with ADHD had a thinner cortex in the areas of the brain responsible for attention control. The researchers behind a small 2013 study found that methylphenidate, Ritalin, increased dopamine levels in the brain and improved attention in adults both with and without ADHD. They also observed that both groups of participants had an equivalent availability of dopamine receptors in the brain. They concluded that their results suggest that dopamine dysregulation is unlikely to be the leading cause of ADHD in adults. In a study from a 2015 trusted source, Researchers identified an association between genetic changes in the DAT1 gene and mood instability in healthy adults. Mood instability tends to be a persistent symptom in people with ADHD. A source suggests that the disruption of the dopaminergic system may play a role in the development of depression. One of the many consequences of reduced dopamine in the synapses is that the significance of tasks is decreased. If most stimuli appear equally compelling, it's difficult to attend to the most important task. As a result, stimuli need greater personal relevance, larger, more immediate or repeated rewards to be attractive to ADHD brains. Reward deficiency syndrome, RDS, has been proposed to explain why ADHD brains need stronger incentives. Deficits in the reward pathway, including decreased availability of dopamine receptors, decrease motivation. Indeed, ADHD brains struggle to sustain motivation when rewards are mild or are linked to long-term gratification. As a result, ADHD brains search for stimulation that can increase dopamine more quickly and intensely. Ultimately, the pursuit of pleasurable rewards may become a potent form of self-medication. In fact, dependent brains exhibit similar dysregulation of the dopamine reward system. Every behavioral reward that has been studied has been shown to amplify dopamine production, including food, sex, exercise, competition, and music. High-risk activities, driving fast, motorcycle riding, and water skiing, motivate ADHD brains to focus. Some extreme activities, like daring ski jumps, skydiving, or taking fast-acting street drugs, elicit a dopamine spike, the brain's most intense reward. Some ADHD brains have benefited from the greater dopamine involvement that is intrinsic to high-intensity, high-risk careers, like those of emergency medical technicians, firefighters, and ER doctors. However, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, opiates, risky sex, pornography, gambling, physical risk-taking, reckless driving, and compulsive buying increase dopamine even more. In fact, all the substances or behaviors that can ultimately result in dependencies have the ability to increase the release of impulse-reinforcing dopamine and reduce the impulse-inhibiting effects of serotonin. The search for stimulation. So ADHD brains are highly motivated to find that unique balance of stimulation that enables optimal functioning. Whether ADHD brains overreact or underreact to the stimuli at hand, they rarely engage with moderate stimulation that falls in the gray area. ADHD brains tend to respond at one end of the continuum in most, but not all, areas of functioning. These opposite routes to the same goal explain how a high-energy, outgoing, talkative, oversubscribed individual and a shy, low-energy, passive, and withdrawn individual can each have an ADHD brain. For some ADHD brains, optimal functioning involves augmenting the existing stimulation, seeking louder, faster, bigger, funnier, and riskier. The more intense, the better. Boredom is a common complaint for the owners of these brains. For them, it is physiologically uncomfortable when their under-aroused brains struggle to engage with their environment. In fact, in mundane, low-stimulation situations, these restless brains may compel their owners to increase the intensity level with fidgeting, noise, laughter, or conflict, if there is no other route to high stimulation available. These more impulsive ADHD brains have their own logic. If some stimulation is good, more is better. This is the signature short-sighted philosophy of brains compelled to choose immediate rewards over long-term gratification. All right. So, on a personal scale, this is all too familiar for me. I get bored a lot. And when I'm, let's say, watching a television program or a movie, if if the movie's really not all that engaging, like if it's kind of engaging, or if it's like fun but it's not like keeping you on the edge of of your seat kind of engagement, I tend to get bored. And honestly, what I end up doing is I end up grabbing my cell phone and my tablet at the same time, and I'll have those both going. I know it's crazy. To a neurotypical person, I can't imagine being able to that they'd be able to have three things going on at once and being able to pay attention. Now the irritating part is that it's difficult for me to pay attention to the movie. I end up missing most of it or quite a bit of it because of the fact that I'm distracted. Like I'm so not into it enough that I've got my tablet on and I'm looking and going, excuse me. Oh, I apologize for the yawn. Going through multiple doing all sorts of things on the tablet, like going different apps, being online, looking at information, going into forums, and then on my phone doing the same thing. So I'm unsuccessfully multitasking while watching the movie. And that's because I'm not getting any kind of dopamine hit in my head. It's it's quite easy, to be honest, to happen. Thankfully, like, I don't smoke. I do drink like one coffee, sometimes two in a day. I only have a small glass of alcohol, maybe, well, three times a week, I guess you could say. I don't do drugs. I definitely don't do risky sex. I do have to say that I am into pornography, and I'm not much of a gambler. I guess the dopamine hit for me is more to do with solving and resolving curiosity. Like I have a high level of curiosity. I love researching. I love finding stuff like online that is really interesting to me, that resolves it, like that makes me feel like I'm enjoying myself, right? Like sitting down and having a conversation with a person, unless the topic is really really interesting, like, and the topics could be things like sports, certain movies, like history, like hockey, football. There are a number of things that to me are really interesting, like drawing, art. Talking about ADHD is really exciting and really drives the dopamine levels in my brain. But talking about stuff that isn't necessarily related to it can more often than not, I get bored of the conversation shortly after. I do have a really good ability to stay involved in a conversation, but my brain is constantly being pulled away. And then what it does is it starts to create this whole, like, in my mind, with this feeling of, okay, I got to get out of this conversation. I got to do something that is exciting, that is fun. I'm bored with this whole thing, right? And it does happen quite often when I'm involved in conversations with some people. And things like getting easily distracted because there's no dopamine in my brain, that's like the levels are super low. I'm constantly trying to find something to cure that or to increase that dopamine level. I have a friend whose boyfriend was always looking for dopamine hits, like addicted to it. Dopamine hit for everything. Like, there was not enough stimulation in his brain and he needed to have a dopamine hit all the time. Like driving a motorcycle or a dirt bike, for example. Like that's going out onto the hills and into the mountains, or onto dirt roads, and going through the forest with all the ups and the downs, and going through the very narrow pathways is creating a dopamine hit. It's getting excitement, that reward, right? Like that feeling that you're enjoying this. It's a reward that makes you want to do it again. And it's so similar to things like doing drugs. Like, I don't necessarily have, of course, any experience with that, so I can't necessarily say or agree to that. But based on research that I've seen, a lot of people are needing that hit, right? So they do, if the typical things that they are at one time were finding it exciting enough to get a dopamine hit, eventually they were running out of that. It wasn't affecting them anymore. It's like your brain gets used to it, and it takes more and more to create that same sort of dopamine rush or that increased level, so that you can feel that feeling that you get, that emotion and the reward feelings that you achieve from that dopamine level increase. And it can definitely be dangerous, as I explained earlier in the podcast. People like to do extreme activities, or they like to do dangerous activities like driving recklessly, motorcycle riding, doing things like skydiving. They need some sort of stimulation in order to feel good and feel right within their mind. And when they don't get it, they end up getting bored. And as you all well know, with ADHD, you have a greater chance of losing focus and being able to continue like doing anything. Really, you get bored easily, and you end up being distracted by something that you all of a sudden appears out of nowhere or appears out of the corner of your eye, and you stop doing the thing that you're working on, and you go to this new task or this new object that is more stimulating because it's giving you that dopamine hit. Now the problem is that because of all the other symptoms that ADHD has, you will forget about the other, like the past that you've done, like that past work that you were working on, or that task that you were doing. Like if you're at home and you're cleaning the house, or you're washing dishes, or putting clothes away or something, and then you get distracted because of it, all of a sudden you're going, hey, oh crap, I forgot. Oops, I was working on something, and then it could be like hours later, and you completely forget about it. It could be something as simple as making dinner, and you get distracted by something on TV or a phone call, and you completely forget that you're doing it. It happens for most of us, I know, and for me, it does happen quite often. The dopamine levels increase are really what we're looking for, and we can definitely get addicted to it, but it's not the dopamine that you're getting addicted to. It's the activity that's causing the increase in the dopamine levels that we get addicted to. It can definitely be very life-threatening if it gets to a very extreme level. Okay, everybody, I am going to take a break. When I get back, we will continue to discuss dopamine with ADHD, okay? All right, everybody, talk to you later. Welcome back, everybody, to Living with ADHD and CPTSD. This is, again, an ADHD episode, and I am talking about dopamine. Okay, so, as we discussed, dopamine addiction and the need for dopamine in our brains really is a goal or a drive for many of us who have ADHD. So, in relation to that, we'll talk about too much stimulation. So, in their hunger for greater stimulation, ADHD brains can suddenly find themselves in a state of over-arousal. Egged on by their need, most are unable to modulate their responses and can't anticipate an impending crash. The fun suddenly gets out of control. The laughter takes on a tinge of hysteria. Sights and sounds bombard them until they are overwhelmed, ambushed by physiological overload and depleted of psychic energy. They become irritable, tearful, restless, or aggressive, and their brains abruptly demand respite from the commotion so that they can regroup with negligible stimulation. Their sudden and total withdrawal is a source of confusion and consternation to those who only know the spirited stimulation seeker. At the other end of the continuum, there are ADHD brains that can barely tolerate existing levels of stimulation. These brains teeter on the brink of sensory overload and seek every opportunity to escape from the bombardment. Unexpected or novel stimulation is experienced as an ambush, evoking discomfort, frustration, and irritation. Owners of hypersensitive brains reduce stimulation by avoiding group activities, tuning out of conversations, and isolating themselves. They shun busy department stores, loud concerts, big parties, and prefer to stay where they can control the level of stimulation. These brains find comfort in the self-contained world of video games, with an internal structure that offers complete control over the kind and amount of stimulation. They select games with rewards that are strongly reinforcing to their brains. These rewards offer pleasure within a cocoon, shielding them from the unpredictable minefield of personal interaction. As a result, video games have incredible habit-forming potential for the inattentive ADHD brain. Carbs, chocolate, and the brain's glucose metabolism. Food activates the dopamine reward center in all brains. However, especially for the more impulsive ADHD brain, it leads to a torturous daily self-regulation challenge. The low levels of dopamine interfere with focused self-regulation, increasing the likelihood that ADHD brains will be inattentive to the factors that modulate eating behaviors. In addition, ADHD brains exhibit decreased glucose metabolism compared to non-ADHD brains, resulting in less energy available to the attention center in the prefrontal cortex. As a result, ADHD brains send out distress messages demanding more glucose, and the owners of these brains suddenly crave sugary foods and carbohydrates, which can be quickly converted into glucose. Glucose increases dopamine and serotonin, so brains experience pleasure and greater calm. Many people with ADHD chide themselves for indulging in pasta and cookies when their brains are actually demanding those foods instead of salad. Chocolate is appealing to ADHD brains because it increases glucose and has the added stimulation of caffeine. It is no wonder that those with ADHD struggle with diet and nutrition. When they self-medicate with food, their brains enjoy a surge of dopamine and increase in glucose-based energy that improves attention and a serotonin-based calming of restlessness. Particularly for the impulsive ADHD brain, this perfect storm of rewards increases the likelihood of overeating. Sleep and the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system, RAS, in the brainstem is responsible for regulating arousal and sleep-wake cycle. In ADHD brains, the RAS is dysregulated. Circadian cycles skew towards higher activity levels in the evening, resulting in later bedtimes and waking times. In fact, many individuals with ADHD celebrate when they finally have time to themselves late at night. This is when they are attracted to internally driven activities like watching TV, engaging with social media, looking at porn, or playing computer games. With their greater arousal, which is often experienced as a second wind, these brain-pleasing behaviors are reinforcing. Studies show that the blue LED light from screens further increases alertness while suppressing the normal elevation of melatonin. With delayed melatonin production, ADHD brains are flooded with both internal and external stimulation into the early morning, delaying sleep and making it difficult to be an early riser. Yeah, that's true. I have to say that I often get that when I am up, like at night. I don't get a ton of sleep. It's not necessarily all related to ADHD symptoms for poor sleep, but I know that when my brain is starting to wake up in the morning, I do get that, like that feeling like your brain just can't stop thinking, right? So it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, and you're waking up, and there's no way you're going to get back to sleep. But then later on in the day, I will feel like a drop, and it lasts for a while. But then in the evenings, it's like suddenly you have that. I got this like explosion of more energy and more ability to do things. And it's true, I do like being at late at night alone with myself so that I can, stimulate my brain, uh, like going on to my tablet and watching videos or reading up on the news, or getting updated on social events, going on to social media like Facebook or Twitter, or YouTube, right? Like it happens, and it's really exciting, and it does cause at times difficulties getting to sleep at night, which is kind of frustrating because I'm trying to get a decent night's sleep. I do go to bed at a decent time most nights, and I wake up roughly about 7.5 to 8 hours after, but I'm not necessarily sleeping the whole time. And a lot of it is pretty much because when I do wake up, like I'm laying there and I'm half awake, and eventually the brain will start to go, and it is virtually impossible to get back to sleep once that has started. So that it's it's really an intense situation, and without medication there is no way to really control that. Now, it's the whole idea of taking the medication to increase the dopamine. Like there's some medications, like the stimulant medications, have been said to increase the stimulation in the mind, whereas there is a non-stimulant medication out there that it increases the ability for the brain to absorb dopamine, because some ADHD brains don't have the ability to take much, it's such a low amount that it's almost like it gets wasted, right? Because your brain can only absorb so much, and the stimulation, so you're not getting the proper amount of dopamine, and you're not like you're on and you're going for a short period of time, and then you suddenly are just done. Like you no longer feel that same desire to continue doing what you're doing. You are suddenly getting bored and you're losing interest, and then you're going to get easily distracted just like that. And I know that it happens for me often, and it's true. Like I do have a this craving for foods that that increase the stimulation for in that area, the dopamine neurotransmitters, and you do get that satisfaction. Like you eat the chocolate, or there's certain candies that have a sugar, the sugar inside, that when it gets into your system you feel that sense of satisfaction, like it's a reward, right? And it's not healthy because it first off, too much sugar is definitely not good for the body. It gives you that. It's like in a way, yeah, it is like an addiction to that, because you eat sugary foods, your brain wants it more often, right? So there's that large craving to eat more food that has sugar in it, and so you do, unless you're able to control it, which for people with ADHD is extremely difficult, obviously. You will most likely develop an eating disorder where you eat too much, like you overeat and you start gaining weight, and you can affect your health, you can affect the ability, like your organ health and your brain health, and you're more likely to develop diseases and problems with the brain because of it. So you have to really be careful with how you eat, and what you eat, with and reducing or eliminating the sugar, in order to, like, I know that it's tough, and I'm sure a lot of you out there have this situation where you do eat a lot of sugar-related foods, candies, chocolates, and you get that dopamine hit, and you feel that satisfaction from the food that you're eating, which is, well, clearly is not healthy. But I get that it's a thing that your brain is doing that makes it very difficult to control and to regulate. And it's the whole thing with it is not good. Like, let's just put it this way. Because of the lack of dopamine, and you feel it, right? Every time you get that hit, you feel the satisfaction, you feel that pleasure that you get from the dopamine, and you want it more. It's pretty clear. You want more of it because of the fact that it feels good, which is the whole point. It feels good in your mind and your body, throughout your body, and you want more of it. However you can get it, through food, through entertainment, through exercise. Like, I like to get it through exercise, through video games, through movies, through extreme sports related activities. All those things lead to that increase and lead to that pleasure seeking feeling that you want when you get the dopamine hit. And when you don't get it, you're obviously feeling very irritated, and you're feeling really bored, and you're feeling really anxious because you need that in order to continue to feel good about yourself, or feel good with your body and in your mind. And when you're not getting it, it's frustrating, and it causes other problems like that are related to ADHD. You're less likely to be able to focus. Your inattentive likelihood increases a lot. You can't sit still. You fidget more often, or you either that, or you start thinking that you need to find more means of getting that stimulation. And you start to realize that what you're currently doing is not enough, so you got to get more, and you got to find more, and you got to go for the larger, like the bigger hits and the more extreme pleasure in order to get that. And it can be very unhealthy for you in a dangerous way, and financially it can be bad. It can be, there's just so many ways that it can affect you in a negative way. Proper medication through a doctor or like a psychiatrist, or after getting diagnosed, and making sure it's properly regulated and you're taking the right amount and the proper medication, can definitely help with this. And it will hopefully alleviate the need for that reward, that pleasure that you get from the dopamine hit. Okay, everybody, that's the end of today's episode. I'd just like to let everybody know that if you haven't watched it yet, I was on Janaea Barnes' show, Self-Sabotaging Sagas. I was there on Tuesday of this past week, and we talked for over an hour about CPTSD. I do have it on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Living with ADHD and CPTSD. I am going to add it into my podcast. There will be a link there you can select if you want to watch it through there. I am on Twitter. It's at ADHD and CPTSD. There is my Facebook page. Please visit my website, www.livingwithadhdandcptsd.ca. You can definitely leave me a message. Tell me what you think. If you have any ideas for the show, please do let me know. I am always looking for new and fun things to talk about on my show. And I am on Patreon. You can look me up there. You can subscribe to my podcast through Anchor if you want some bonus material. I do have my video. I recorded this episode, so there's a bonus video podcast version of this show that you can watch. That's actually been quite popular. I've been getting a lot of people watching that, so you might be interested in that. Check out Russell Barkley. He is a psychiatrist or psychologist, who specializes in ADHD. If you do have any interesting questions or you're looking for some sort of information or scientific stats to back up ADHD claims or questions, go on YouTube and look him up. And he does have his website as well. Okay, everyone. Well, it is December 24th and it's Christmas Eve. So if you have family to be with, I definitely hope that you are having a good evening and go and have some fun. Try to relax, have some food, watch some Christmas movies, or do whatever you guys do for tradition on Christmas Eve, and have a very Merry Christmas on Saturday. I will be back with another episode on Friday, December 31st. It will be pre-recorded, but it will be a new episode. So there we go. All right. Everybody have a great night and a wonderful Christmas. All right. Talk to you then.